Picture this. You come over for a visit. The door opens, the host reaches out their hand, and at the last second, snatches it back. No, we can't greet across the threshold. Step inside first, or we'll fall out. Most people have heard this superstition at least once. You don't shake hands, hug, kiss, or pass things across a threshold. Even a completely rational person will sometimes automatically step into the apartment before shaking hands. But why should an ordinary wooden plank under a door affect relationships between people? How can a single handshake lead to a quarrel? And who, according to the darkest version of this superstition, is standing right beneath the feet of a person on the threshold? Today, we think of the threshold as just a part of the doorway. It covers the gap under the door, keeping out drafts, water, dirt, and cold. But for people of the past, the threshold was much more than a structural detail. The home was seen as a special, protected space. Inside were the family, the fire, food supplies, animals, and everything a person owned. Beyond the walls lay the outside world, unfamiliar, uncontrollable, and potentially dangerous. Out there was the forest, wild beasts, strangers, disease, bandits, and the forces of nature. And once darkness fell, that outside space became even more frightening. The walls separated one space from another. But every house had vulnerable spots: the windows, the chimney, and the door. And it wasn't only welcome guests who could slip inside through them. That's why, in many cultures, doors, gates, and thresholds took on special symbolic meaning. People tried to protect them with amulets, signs, prayers, and various rituals. The threshold belonged to the house, and to the outside world at the same time. Whoever stood on it had already left the street, but had not yet come inside. They were caught between two spaces. In anthropology, such places are called boundary zones, or liminal spaces. The word liminal itself comes from the Latin word for threshold. At boundaries, the usual rules seem to weaken. A person finds themselves suspended between two states, old and new, safe and dangerous, familiar and foreign. That's exactly why thresholds appear so often in rites that mark major life changes. Brides were carried across them. People stepped over them when moving into a new home. Protective rituals were performed beside them. A threshold could mark a person's passage from one state of being to another. Inside the home, the guest was welcomed. They were offered food, a place by the fire, and the host's protection. But as long as they remained outside, they were still a stranger. So what happened when the host and the guest shook hands across the threshold? One person stood within the protected space of the house, the other beyond it. The handshake seemed to join two worlds, without letting either person fully cross to the other side. Symbolically, the greeting was incomplete. People had made contact, but the boundaries still divided them. That may be where the idea came from, that the relationship itself would soon be divided too. Today we'd say, something has come between us. For a person of the past, that barrier could be entirely real, a wooden threshold sitting between two people at the moment of greeting. If a quarrel followed, it was easy to blame on the broken taboo. See, I told you, we shouldn't have greeted each other across the threshold. But there was an even darker explanation. In folk belief, every part of a house could have its own invisible guardian. The most famous of them was the domovoi, a spirit who watched over the household, protected the family, and kept things in proper order. Most often, he was said to dwell near the stove, in the cellar, up in the attic, or in a dark corner. But in some traditions, the domovoi was thought to live right under the threshold. That spot suited him perfectly, given its significance. The spirit stood at the boundary and was the first to meet anyone who tried to enter the house. A kind guest crossed the threshold and came under the host's protection, but someone with bad intentions could bring envy, illness, conflict, or misfortune along with them. The domovoi, it was believed, had to decide who to let in and who to hold back. That's why lingering, sitting, or chatting on the threshold was seen as a bad idea. You'd only be getting in the invisible guardian's way. Stepping on the threshold meant showing him disrespect, and passing things over it meant intruding on the space he ruled. A handshake across the threshold could disturb him too. An angered domovoi supposedly stopped protecting the home, started hiding things, scaring animals, and stirring up quarrels between people. And so, an ordinary greeting became a dangerous act. But there's an even more famous story. Some claim that the ancient Slavs buried the ashes of their deceased relatives right beneath the threshold. The ancestor remained close to the family even after death, guarding the entrance. So stepping on the threshold, standing on it, or passing objects over it supposedly meant disturbing the departed. This version sounds impressive and shows up often in modern retellings of the superstition's origins. And it's true, various cultures did have burials near dwellings and beneath certain parts of them. The threshold was also connected to the dead, to spirits, and to the passage between worlds. Sometimes, people who, for one reason or another, weren't buried in the common cemetery were laid to rest near the entrance. But saying that all ancient Slavs buried their ancestors under every threshold would be a stretch. There's simply not enough solid evidence for that. Funerary customs varied with the time, the region, and the specific community. Most of the dead were buried in designated burial grounds, not under living quarters. So the story about ancestral ashes beneath every threshold is most likely a later, heavily simplified explanation. Still, the connection between the threshold and the world of the dead didn't come out of nowhere. The threshold represented a transition from one space to another, and in traditional culture, death was also understood as a transition, from the world of the living to the other world. If a person could step from the street into the house, then a spirit, by folk logic, could cross from the invisible world into the human one. That's why people tried to be careful around the threshold. They didn't just avoid shaking hands across it. Sitting on the threshold was forbidden, especially for pregnant women and children. No one lingered on it when leaving the house. People tried not to argue or hold important conversations over it. The threshold wasn't a place for daily life. It was a crossing point. You were supposed to step over it quickly and with respect. For the same reason, people were advised not to pass things across the threshold. Picture this. One person stands inside the house, another outside. Between them is a boundary. The object passes over it, but neither person crosses the line themselves. For a moment, the object seems to belong to no one. It's already left one space, but hasn't yet arrived in the other. For the modern person, it's just an ordinary gesture, but in the world of magical thinking, that same moment was genuinely dangerous. Hand something across the threshold, and luck, health, or prosperity could slip out of the house along with it. Money, bread, salt, and anything tied to a person's private life, people treated those with particular caution. These things were never just property. They were seen as carriers of well-being. Hand them over across the boundary of the house, and you might symbolically give away a piece of your family's fortune. The person on the receiving end was taking a risk too. Along with the object, they could accept someone else's troubles, a sickness, or even ill intent. That's why the rule was, either come fully inside or step completely outside, and only then make the exchange. That way, both people stood in the same space, and the exchange was considered properly made. Interestingly, the same logic still lives on in the way we speak. We say, "Don't let him cross the threshold," when we don't want to see someone in our home. Camping on someone's doorstep, that's what we call it when someone keeps coming back again and again, hoping to finally be received. And crossing the threshold? That's stepping not just into a room, but into a whole new chapter of life. The very word threshold still marks a boundary, the point where one state ends and another begins. Even the wedding tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold is tied to this idea of transition. The bride was leaving one family and entering another. In her new home, she was still a stranger, so crossing that boundary came with special rituals. According to one version, the groom carried her so she wouldn't accidentally step on something dangerous and anger the spirits of the new house. According to another, the carry showed that the bride was entering the home under her husband's protection. There's no single definitive origin for this custom either, but it shows just how much importance was placed on that moment of crossing the entrance. Step over the threshold, and you didn't just walk into a room, your very status changed. A stranger became a guest. A bride became a member of a new family. A returning traveler was, once again, home. Even a handshake was more than a polite gesture. An open, extended hand showed you carried no weapon and came with peaceful intentions. But to truly confirm trust, both people had to stand on the same side of the boundary. If the threshold stayed between their hands, The symbolic agreement just didn't take. And yet, this prohibition might have had a perfectly practical explanation all along. A doorway is an awkward place for a conversation or an exchange. One person stands outside, the other holds the door, and cold air, rain, snow, or insects sneak into the house. And there might be other people right behind them trying to get through. In a small house, a guest lingering at the entrance was a real problem. Besides, the host wanted a moment to decide. Was he letting this person in at all? A greeting inside meant hospitality. A greeting on the doorstep could mean the conversation would be short and the visitor wasn't welcome to stay. The rule, come in first, say hello after, helped everyone avoid that awkward uncertainty. And the threshold was the easiest place in the world to drop something. If you were passing over something fragile, food, water, or money, down it went into the dirt or lost forever. And then the arguing would begin. Whose fault was it? The one who handed it over or the one who fumbled the catch? So yes, passing something across the threshold really could end in a quarrel. Just no spirits involved. Over time, the practical rule grew its own mystical explanations. It was easier to tell a child, don't pass things over the threshold or you'll have a falling out, than to carefully explain the symbolism of the home, the rules of hospitality, and the risk of dropping something. A short prohibition was easy to remember, and easy to hand down to the next generation. But why does this superstition still hold up today? Because we tend to notice only the things that confirm a warning we already know. If people shake hands across a threshold and keep getting along just fine, nobody thinks twice about it. But if they end up in a conflict a week later, that unusual greeting suddenly comes back to mind. It all started with that very handshake. In reality, the quarrel could have come from dozens of perfectly ordinary reasons. But the superstition offers a simple and vivid explanation. It also shapes how people behave. If someone genuinely believes that greeting across a threshold will lead to a conflict, they start to feel uneasy after accidentally doing it. Every awkward word suddenly feels like the first sign of a coming fight. So the mere expectation of something bad can change how we communicate. No mysticism required. Is there any actual proof that shaking hands over a threshold really destroys a relationship? No. A threshold can't control human friendship. There's no mechanism hidden under it that triggers a quarrel the moment two hands touch. But this superstition has preserved an ancient way of seeing the home as a separate world. The threshold was the line between the familiar and the foreign, between safe and dangerous, between the visible and the unseen. People didn't linger on it. They tried not to disturb it, and any exchange was finished on one side or the other. And that's exactly why people were asked to step inside before anyone greeted them. Not because the wooden plank had some mystical power, but because a truly welcomed guest was supposed to be inside the house. Today we can say hello and pass things to each other anywhere we like. But if someone refuses to shake your hand across a threshold, the easiest thing is to just take one step forward. Not out of fear of the household spirit, and not to protect yourself from some ancient curse. It's just that some boundaries are easier to step across than to try to prove they don't exist. Do you greet people across the threshold? Were you told it would cause a fight, disturb the household spirit, or anger an ancestor's spirit? Tell us in the comments what explanation for this superstition has been passed down in your family.